Good afternoon and welcome to another A-Push video with Mr. Pate for Barlow High School. Here we go. We're going to talk about how the issues in World War I and the interwar period lead to World War II. So Europe is devastated during World War I. It's physically devastated. The countries of Europe in the areas where the fighting was intense have been physically destroyed. And the areas that fighting occurred they've been economically traumatized as well. Certainly there's an emotional trauma. They've lost an entire generation of young men in many countries. And of course Germany and Russia, now the Soviet Union, and other countries are going to be just economically wrecked. And this is going to lead to depressions economically throughout the 1920s and a lot of instability, and it's going to feed the growth of these dictators as they show up. The Treaty of Versailles, designed to greatly punish Germany. It's going to say everything's Germany's fault, call for them to pay crippling reparation payments to rebuild Western Europe. This is not a good idea. History showed us this was a really bad idea. Punishing them instead of lifting up and kind of rebuilding them and making your ally only made them mad and kind of ready to have someone like Hitler blame everyone else. Japan gets slighted, and we'll talk about that with some of these conferences and treaties, but Japan is going to feel like they get a raw deal and they're treated like a junior partner. Now, we saw some flickering, embers of this with problems like, related to the Gentleman's Agreement, TR's a negotiation in the Russo-Japanese treaty, where he gets in and negotiates it. Japan is mad at him after that. The Gentleman's Agreement, where you had the San Francisco School Board that was discriminating against Japanese students in America. The Japanese are mad. They're proud as a people and very angry about the fact they feel like the U.S. treats them like lesser people or a lesser country at least. And their nationalism is going to be enraged by this. So Japan feels slighted. Germany is over-punished by the Treaty of Versailles. You end up with a war-phobic Western Europe. Western Europe is sitting there and they are going to be paralyzed. And we're going to see this when we talk about appeasement and what happens with Czechoslovakia. But basically, the Western Europeans, they'd rather do anything than consider the possibility of going to war. You also have an isolationist United States. The U.S. is disillusioned. They're not very happy about what they see happening. They aren't happy with the Treaty of Versailles. Everything about the way the war ended leaves them with a bitter taste in their mouth. They're determined not to get involved again. The United States becomes isolationistic, retreating into, we're not going to be involved in what happens in Europe once again. In the 1920s, a manifestation of this kind of war-phobic Western Europe and this isolationist United States, you start to see reactions in the 1920s that occur. And these are just myopic, stupid, idealistic ideas that just have no chance of working. The worst one being the last one we'll talk about, or the last couple, I guess. The League of Nations. So this is a decent attempt to say, hey, let's have an international body where all the nations can discuss their problems and let's make this the war to end all wars. Okay, great idea. It's not going to have the enforcement ability or the buy-in from countries around the world that the United Nations has today in general. Not that that's a perfect organization, but it's certainly endured and done some successful things. The Washington Naval Conference. This is going to be saying, hey, well, you know what? Cause of war, one of them was we had these large navies. They caused some problems. Let's limit the size of navies. This is a bad idea because Great Britain and the United States allowed themselves to have a larger number. In this and subsequent other naval treaties that are formed, they can have a larger navy than Japan. Japan feels slighted. They're not going to be very happy about this. They're actually pretty angry. The Dawes Plan. The Dawes Plan shows how the system in Europe is very tenuous because basically Germany can't make their payments to Western Europe. The United States has loaned tons of money and war production goods, weapons, etc., supplies to Western European countries. They can't pay it back without Germany paying them back. So the Dawes Plan is basically the United States as a government loans money to Germany. Germany then uses that money to just repay some of what they owe to the Western European countries to get them off their back. Then the Western European countries use that money to pay U.S. banks. So everybody kind of wipes off their debts, but the U.S. government gives U.S. banks money and basically gets ripped off. That's not really that different because the United States is always coughing up money for the benefit of other countries and really doesn't see much back from that, other than they're kind of buying friendship in a stable world, which is an important thing. We'll see more of this after World War II. The United States continues to this day to cough up large amounts of money helping other countries. And again, world stability is a great thing and allows our business to flourish, so there you go. The Locarno Pact is this idea that's trying to establish this spirit of peace and defensiveness, but not offensive behavior among countries. Similar, but even worse, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This is the epitome of dumb. They outlaw war and say you can only fight if you're attacked. You can fight defensively. So all these countries agree to sign this thing and say, yeah, we will not go to war. War should be illegal. It's bad. Well, most wars, someone basically goads someone else into attacking them or uses some incident as a pretext to go to war, and then they could claim they were fighting defensively. So this is just something with no chance of success. The London Economic Conference. The United States refuses to engage as European countries are trying to they're trying to find ways to stabilize the economies of Europe. The United States doesn't want to be involved. And this again is kind of showing that isolationistic United States. The United States is like, hey, whatever, but just leave us out of it. We don't want anything to do with this. So in a variety of ways, you see a very dysfunctional situation. And as you have angry totalitarian governments rise in several countries, I don't want to forget about Italy, but we're not going to really talk about them today. They're a minor junior partner to Germany and Japan. We'll talk about Germany and Japan as these dictators rise, as they basically start to try and take over their neighbors and make these great empires. The United States, Western Europe continues to be afraid of war, and the United States continues to be disillusioned and isolationistic until they have to jump in. So, Germany. Germany is going to, in 1933, looking at kind of the rise now, Hitler's already in power, and he consolidates his power. This is also not talking about, it'll be a subject for a podcast, the Holocaust, which we'll touch on a little bit, and basically the ramping up the persecution of Jewish people in Europe, especially in Germany, by Hitler, making them the scapegoat for everything. So that's not on the list. This is more just like governmental international actions. So 1933, Germany's going to withdraw from the League of Nations. In 1937, they reject the Treaty of Versailles. In 1938, they're going to form their Anschluss with Austria. Hitler says, well, we should do this because there are a lot of, it's a German-speaking people. There are a lot of Germans in Austria. We're reuniting the greater motherland of Germany. And so he calls it the Anschluss. And basically, it's a peaceful takeover where Austria just says, sure, come on in. Well, most of Austria. 1938, Munich Pact. Now, here we get to a term, it's called appeasement. And great book. The best book you could ever read on World War II is Memoirs of the Second World War by Winston Churchill, who was, of course, the British Prime Minister during the war, or for the vast majority of the war. And he has a chapter in there called Follies of the Victors, where he really goes into great detail about all the mistakes that are made by the Allies because of their fear of war. This is the central one of those mistakes and examples of that fear. Appeasement is basically giving in to a dictator to basically try and appease them, to get them to leave you alone, hoping that'll be enough that they'll leave you alone and not mess with you. At the Munich Pact, Hitler basically had threatened that there was going to be war if he wasn't given what he called the Sudetenland, which was the western portion of the Czech Republic. Or excuse me, no Czech Republic back then, Czechoslovakia. But he's going to say, hey, if I get this, it's my last territorial demand. These are German people in Czechoslovakia. I want them reunited. We're getting all the Germans together in in the Germany, the overall motherland of Germany. And with all of us in one big country, I'll be happy. It's my last territorial demand. Famous last words, right? So, of course, this is going to be where the leaders of Britain and France go in and basically force Czechoslovakia to give up its western territory, the Sudetenland. And once they do, this is now late 1938, Hitler says war is averted. And, especially Neville Chamberlain goes back to Britain, who actually was Winston Churchill's main rival. And he said, hey, we have peace in our time. Hitler has pledged to not ever go to war with us. People are so eager to avoid war, so frightened of war. This is a very successful thing. In the invasion of Czechoslovakia comes the next spring. Hitler, having taken the western part and having removed basically the defensive abilities of the mountain range that in the Alps that the Czechs had, along with a formidable defense, he's able to overrun them, and now everyone's like, oh, crud. He said it was going to be his last demand. He's reoccupied areas. In the Rhineland, he's taken over Austria. He wanted the Sudetenland. Now he's taken over all Czechoslovakia. So Britain and France basically say, anymore, we're going to war. But it's too late. They've let him just keep building up, and building up. And of course, he will later take over Poland, although that's a subject for the next podcast. I'll kind of show you on a map these things going on. Japan, invasion of Manchuria, 1931. And this is going to be something the United States condemns. You have the U.S. issues something called the Hoover-Stimson Doctrine, saying we will never recognize territory taken by force. And this makes Japan mad. Now, early on, the United States was less involved over here because the U.S. Asian territorial interests. They're going to have more of a response to what the Japanese do frequently than they do to what's happening in Europe until we get really far down the line and really start getting almost to war happening itself. And I'll talk in the podcast about why America's so isolationistic. But the invasion of Manchuria happens. The U.S. doesn't really do anything other than scold them. You have, between 1931 and 1934, Japan pulls out of the naval treaties, the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations. They just ditch all of that stuff. 1936, they formally join this anti-Comintern Pact and become part of the Axis with Germany and Italy. And then in 1937, you have the invasion of China. A notable awful thing from this is the rape of Nanking. And basically they're just trying to subdue China, and they get kind of embroiled in this massive warfare. They control the coastline of China. The interior is controlled by the Chinese. The Panay incident. Basically, the Japanese fire on a U.S. ship, and they kill Americans. And they damage the ship. And Americans are starting to get mad. But again, Americans aren't interested in going to war either. And so when Roosevelt basically starts to look at the polling numbers and how Americans feel, he decides to just accept the Japanese offer of apology and some money. Now, if you think about this, attacking a U.S. ship, this is worse than the U.S. Maine. They actually attacked it. They killed Americans. They hurt U.S. ships. And yet, even though they're going to, get rid of our ships, basically, this is not going to be going to war type of... This is not going to be enough motivation to go to war because of how people feel about war. America is so isolationistic and doesn't want to get involved in someone else's problem. This emboldens the Japanese. This emboldens them. The fact the U.S. doesn't do anything really at these different steps, just like the European countries didn't really do anything to Germany, is a significant factor in Japanese continuing their territorial growth. In 1940, the U.S. does, after attack on what is today's Vietnam and just continuing to take over more and more of Southeast Asia. Japan had no real natural resources, so these are attempts to gain natural resources and control a larger regional area and make an empire. But the U.S. embargo on trade with Japan is going to eventually hamstring the Japanese with oil enough that they are going to make a decision for war. But that's a subject for next time. Stay classy, San Barlow.